I never thought I'd see something so disturbing, so utterly wrong in my life. And yet, here I was standing frozen outside my grandmother's old barn, my heart hammering in my chest. I shouldn't have been here. I shouldn't have followed her. But something told me that whatever was happening inside that barn wasn't normal. And now that I was peering through a small gap in the wooden planks, my hands gripping the rough surface, I knew I would never be able to unsee this. It all started when I moved in with Grandma for the summer. She lived in a quiet, rural town, surrounded by vast fields and thick woods. My parents were traveling overseas, and since I had no plans, they figured I could keep her company. She was always sweet, always loving, always making sure I had everything I needed. At first, everything was normal. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the trees. She'd cook my favorite meals, fuss over my laundry, and make sure I was well rested. But then I noticed something strange. Every single night, just after midnight, she would quietly leave the house. I'd hear the soft creak of the back door, the shuffling of her slippers on the old wooden steps, and then silence. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she just liked taking late-night walks. But then I realized she wasn't going for walks. She was going to the barn. One night, I stayed awake waiting. Just as expected, I heard the creak of the back door. I peeked out my window and saw her, wrapped in her thin nightgown, her silver hair illuminated by the pale moonlight, heading straight for the barn. My stomach twisted. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. I had grown up around animals, spent summers helping out on my grandfather's farm. There was nothing unusual about checking on livestock at night, but Grandma didn't have any animals. Not anymore, except for one. A large, powerful stallion that she kept in the barn. His name was Thunder. I had asked her once why she kept him, even after Grandpa passed. She had smiled, brushing her fingers along the old wooden railing. "Oh, Thunder's special," she had said, her voice soft. I could never part with him. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, as I watched her disappear into the barn, my gut told me something wasn't right. I had to know what she was doing. I slipped out of bed, pulled on my jacket, and carefully crept outside. The night air was cold, sending a shiver down my spine as I made my way across the damp grass. The barn loomed ahead, dark and quiet, except for the faint sound of movement inside. I swallowed hard, pressing myself against the wooden planks. I peeked through a small gap between the boards, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Grandma wasn't alone. She was standing inside the stall, her frail hands reaching out, stroking Thunder's dark, muscled body. Her nightgown clung to her frame, the dim lantern light casting eerie shadows across the barn walls. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, sent a ripple of unease through me. Thunder's massive form shifted slightly, his breath visible in the cool night air. Grandma whispered something, her voice too low for me to hear. My fingers dug into the wood. Why did it feel like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see? Then, suddenly, she turned. For a horrifying second, I thought she had caught me. Her gaze flickered toward the barn door, her expression unreadable. I held my breath, but she didn't move toward me. Instead, she reached up and blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed the barn. And in that moment, I knew I had just seen the beginning of something I wasn't ready to understand. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying what I had just seen over and over. Grandma in the barn, the way she whispered to Thunder, the way she touched him, it didn't make sense. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that she was just checking on him, but my gut told me otherwise. Something was deeply wrong. And the worst part? I knew I was going to go back. The following day, I tried to act normal. Grandma hummed as she made breakfast, setting a plate in front of me with her usual warm smile. "Did you sleep well, sweetheart?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, fine." She tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. "You seem tired." I forced a smile. "Just didn't get much rest." She nodded, turning back to the stove. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something, that she could see right through me. The day dragged on, my mind clouded with questions. And when night fell, I found myself once again lying in bed, waiting. And just like before, the back door creaked open. She was going back to the barn. I threw the blankets off and slipped out of bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. This time I wasn't just going to watch. This time, I was going to find out the truth. The night air was thick with moisture. The smell of hay and damp was surrounding me as I approached the barn. I moved slowly, pressing myself against the wooden structure, peeking through the same small gap I had used the night before. Grandma stood in the dim glow of the lantern, her frail form illuminated by the flickering light. Thunder stood before her, his massive frame barely moving. But it was different this time. She wasn't just touching him. She was leaning against him, pressing her body close. My stomach turned. She whispered something, her lips moving too softly for me to hear. Her hands moved along his side, his neck. And then, she closed her eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to move, to run away, but my body felt frozen, rooted to the spot. And then, Thunder shifted. He let out a deep, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh. Grandma smiled. I clenched my fists. What the hell was I watching? And then, the lantern flickered. For a split second, the light dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows across the barn walls. And in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was something wrong with the way she was standing, with the way her hands moved. It felt deliberate, like she wasn't just checking on him, like she was doing something else. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I needed to get out of here. Now, I turned to leave, and that's when my foot slipped. A loud creak echoed through the night air. My stomach dropped. I whipped my head around, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw her. Grandma was staring directly at me. For a few terrifying seconds, neither of us moved. Grandma stood there in the dim lantern glow, her frail figure casting an eerie shadow against the wooden walls. Her eyes locked onto mine. A chill ran down my spine. I could hear Thunder's heavy breathing behind her, the slow rustling of hay beneath his hooves. Then she smiled, a soft, knowing smile. My stomach twisted. Slowly, she took a step toward me. I didn't know you were awake, sweetheart. Her voice was calm, almost sweet, too sweet. I forced a laugh, my throat dry. Yeah, I just heard something and came to check. She nodded, but her gaze never wavered. She didn't believe me. Come inside, she said softly, gesturing toward the barn door. I want to show you something. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. If I ran, she'd know I had seen too much. So, with shaky legs, I stepped inside. The smell of hay and damp would fill my nose. The air was thick, heavy. Grandma stood beside Thunder, her hands gently running along his strong, muscled body. He's a beautiful creature, isn't he? She murmured. I nodded slowly. Yeah, he is. She smiled, her fingers trailing down his dark coat. You know, she continued, your grandfather used to say that Thunder and I have a special bond. I swallowed hard. Oh. Her gaze flickered toward me. You wouldn't understand, sweetheart. Not yet. I clenched my fists. What the hell was she talking about? She sighed, her hand lingering on Thunder's side. But that's okay. You'll learn soon enough. My breath hitched. Learn? Something inside me snapped. I needed to get out of here. I took a step back, forcing a chuckle. Well, I should probably head back inside. Long day tomorrow. Her eyes darkened. For the first time, her smile faded. You're leaving already? Her voice was soft, but there was something wrong in the way she said it. I forced another laugh. Yeah, Before I could finish, she reached out and grabbed my wrist. Hard. My pulse spiked. I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. You shouldn't have come out here, she whispered. My blood ran cold. I opened my mouth to speak, but then Thunder stomped his hoof against the ground. Loud. The barn walls seemed to tremble from the force. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Grandma let go of me. She turned back toward Thunder, her hand trailing along his body once more. You should go, she murmured. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of that barn, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached the back door of the house, I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder. And that's when I saw her. standing in the barn doorway, watching me. And this time, she wasn't smiling. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Grandma knew. She knew I had followed her. She knew I had seen something, something I wasn't supposed to see. And the way she looked at me when I ran back to the house, it wasn't the look of a sweet old woman anymore. It was something else, something hungry. I woke up to the smell of bacon and coffee. For a brief second, I almost convinced myself that last night had been a bad dream. That is, until I stepped into the kitchen. Grandma was already at the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. She turned to me with her usual warm smile. "Morning, sweetheart," she chirped. "Did you sleep well?" I hesitated. "Oh, yeah." She slid a plate in front of me. "Eat up. You've been looking a little pale lately." I sat down, forcing myself to take a bite. But my hands were shaking. She watched me closely. "You shouldn't go outside so late at night," she said suddenly, stirring her tea. I nearly choked. "W?" Her eyes flickered up to meet mine. "I saw you, sweetheart." A lump formed in my throat. She smiled, taking a slow sip of tea. "It's not safe out there." I nodded quickly, my stomach twisting into knots. She knew. She knew. I told myself I wouldn't do it. I told myself I wouldn't follow her again. But I had to, because no matter how much I tried to ignore it, something wasn't right. So I stayed up, waiting. And like clockwork, the back door creaked open. Grandma was heading back to the barn. I swallowed my fear and followed. The night air was cool, but I felt hot, like my body knew I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to come back from. The barn door was already open. A soft, flickering lantern glowed inside. I crept forward, pressing myself against the wooden planks. And then, I heard her, a low whisper. At first, I thought she was talking to herself. But then Thunder stomped his hoof, and she let out a soft laugh. "You're such a good boy," she murmured. I felt bile rise in my throat. Then something moved. The light inside the barn shifted, and for the briefest moment, I saw her silhouette. She wasn't just standing near him. She was closer, too close. And that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. She wasn't wearing her nightgown anymore. She was wearing nothing. I felt my stomach drop. I had seen enough. I turned, ready to run back to the house, to lock my door and pretend none of this was happening. But before I could take a step, the barn door creaked. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head back toward the gap in the wooden planks. Grandma was still standing there, bathed in the flickering lantern glow. Her back was to me, her thin silver hair cascading down her shoulders. Thunder stood motionless, his breath coming out in slow, heavy huffs. And then she moved. She took a slow step forward, her bare feet sinking into the hay. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Something was very wrong. This wasn't just some harmless connection between a woman and her horse. This was something else, something worse. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped in place, forced to watch as my grandmother continued to whisper. Her hands trailed along Thunder's side, down to his powerful legs. A soft sigh escaped her lips. I pressed my fist against my mouth to keep from making a sound. I needed to get out of here. Now! I took a step back. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight. Grandma snapped her head toward the barn door. My heart stopped. I whipped around and bolted for the house. I didn't stop. Not when I heard the barn door swing open behind me. Not when I heard her voice calling out into the night. Not when my lungs burned or my legs ached. I slammed the back door shut behind me, locked it, and sprinted up the stairs to my room. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. And then, silence. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. Had she seen me? Had she heard me? Or was she still in the barn? I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, exhausted, I collapsed onto my bed. I told myself that in the morning, I would pack my bags and leave. I had to, but deep down I knew. Grandma wasn't going to let me go that easily. I barely slept. Every sound in the house made my heart jump into my throat. The creak of the old wooden floors, the rustling of the trees outside. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I kept my door locked, pressing my back against it as if that would somehow keep me safe. Because I knew Grandma knew. She had seen me. She had heard me. And worst of all, she wasn't going to pretend anymore. The next morning, I forced myself downstairs. I had to act normal. I had to pretend nothing happened. Grandma was already at the table, sipping her tea. She looked up as I walked in and gave me a knowing smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. "Did you sleep well?" I forced a smile. "Yeah," she chuckled. "You must have been so tired. I checked on you last night, but you didn't even stir." I nearly choked on air. She checked on me? I gripped the chair to keep my hands from shaking. "Oh," I muttered, forcing myself to sit down. "Yeah, I guess I was out." She placed a plate in front of me, eggs, toast, and bacon, just like always. But for the first time since moving in, I couldn't eat. The smell made my stomach turn. She watched me closely, her spoon stirring her tea in slow circles. "You seemed restless yesterday," she murmured. "You didn't go outside, did you?" I froze. She was testing me. I forced myself to shake my head. "Nope, just stayed in bed." She nodded slowly, taking a sip of tea. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, "I think you should spend more time in the barn," she said suddenly. My breath hitched. "What?" Her eyes twinkled. "You never visit Thunder." I gripped the table. I've been busy." She tilted her head. "You should go today. He misses you." I forced a laugh. "Grandma, he's a horse." Her smile didn't waver. "You'd be surprised how much he understands." I spent the rest of the day locked in my room, pretending to be sick. I needed a plan. I needed to leave. But how? Grandma wasn't going to let me go that easily. She was watching me too closely. And as night fell, I realized something horrifying. She had never once left for the barn. She was waiting for me. I didn't leave my room. Not for dinner. Not for water. Not for anything. I stayed locked inside, listening for any sound, any sign that Grandma had left for the barn. But she never did. And that was worse, because that meant she was waiting for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with clothes, my phone, and my wallet. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely zip it up. I tiptoed toward the window, easing it open as quietly as possible. The night air hit me cold and damp. I swung one leg over the ledge, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then the bedroom door creaked open. I froze. A long shadow stretched across the wooden floor. My breath hitched. "Sweetheart," Grandma's voice was soft, almost singing. I clenched my teeth, not moving. "You're not leaving, are you?" Slowly, I turned my head. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her thin nightgown, her silver hair glowing in the moonlight. And then, she stepped inside. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. She walked toward me, slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't have gone to the barn," she whispered. My heart stopped. She knew. She had always known. I lunged for the window, but she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong. I gasped, struggling to pull away, but she tightened her hold. "I can't let you go," she whispered. "You understand, don't you?" I shook my head, panic clawing at my throat. Her eyes softened. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed. "You've always been so stubborn, just like your grandfather." She reached up with her free hand and caressed my cheek. My skin crawled. I yanked my arm back, breaking free, and stumbled toward the door. She didn't chase me. She just stood there, smiling, like she knew I had nowhere to go. I ran. I didn't know where, I just ran. Through the back door, across the field, toward the only place I knew she wouldn't follow. The barn. I wasn't thinking straight. I just knew I needed to hide. I reached the heavy wooden doors and threw them open, my lungs burning. The inside was dark and cold, the faint smell of hay filling my nostrils. And then I heard breathing. Slow, deep. I turned. Thunder was there, standing still in his stall, his massive form barely visible in the dim moonlight. I swallowed hard, backing away, and then I heard it, a soft creak, the barn door closing behind me. I whipped around, and there she was, standing in the entrance, her face calm, her eyes hungry. The barn felt smaller than before. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of hay and damp wood. Grandma took a slow step forward, blocking the exit. I stumbled back, my breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. I could hear Thunder's heavy breathing behind me, his massive body shifting slightly in the stall. But my eyes were locked on her, on that soft smile that no longer felt warm. It felt like a trap. "Why did you run, sweetheart?" she asked, tilting her head. I couldn't speak. She sighed, shaking her head. "I wasn't ready for you to see," she murmured, glancing toward Thunder. "But it's okay now. You're part of this?" My stomach turned. I took another step back, feeling the cold metal of the stall door press against my spine. "Grandma," I croaked. I don't understand." She smiled, taking another step toward me. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed. "You will?" And then she reached for me. Her fingers brushed my arm, soft but firm. I flinched, jerking away. Her smile didn't waver. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes glinting in the dim barn light. "It's in your blood, you know," she whispered. I froze. "What?" She chuckled softly, her hand drifting along the wooden railing of the stall. "Your grandfather fought it, too," she murmured. A shiver crawled up my spine. "I don't know what you're talking about." She sighed, shaking her head. "You're not ready." Then she turned to Thunder and whispered something so soft, so low, that I barely caught it. But he reacted. His massive body shifted, his dark eyes locked onto her. My pulse spiked. "Grandma." She turned back to me and smiled. "You'll understand soon, sweetheart." Then the lantern light flickered, and everything went black. I woke up in my bed. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm golden streaks across the wooden floor. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a horrible, twisted nightmare. But then, I looked down. My clothes were covered in hay. My hands smelled of sweat and dirt. And on my wrist, a faint bruise, shaped like fingers. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. A soft knock sounded at my door. I flinched. Then, Grandma's voice. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the door. Because I knew I was never leaving this place.